What they least expect will break them from within. There is always a moment, quiet, unnoticed, almost invisible, when the entire dynamic shifts, not because you said the right words, not because you explained yourself one last time, not because you made a scene or demanded clarity, but because something inside you finally changed direction. They don't see it coming. They never do. They're still focused on the version of you they grew comfortable with. The one who reacted, who stayed available, who kept trying to fix what they never protected. And that's exactly why silence flips the power. Because the real shift doesn't happen in confrontation. It happens when you stop chasing understanding and start standing still in your own ground. In this video, you'll understand why silence works only when it's real, why waiting quietly is not the same as letting go, and how calm, disciplined withdrawal does more than any argument ever could. You'll see how power moves the moment you stop explaining, why people feel unsettled when they lose access to you, and how silence becomes dangerous, not to them, but to the version of you that kept shrinking. Before we go deeper, take a second. If this speaks to you, like the video so others searching for clarity can find it. Subscribe to Stoic Silence if you're ready to start this journey now. A path of discipline, detachment, and inner power. And in the comments, drop a number that reflects where you are right now. 1. If you're still waiting for them to change. 2. If you're choosing yourself. There's no judgment here. Your answer matters. Stay with me, because once you understand why silence flips power, you'll never use your energy the same way again. Now let's dive in. Section 1. The move they never anticipated. What they never see coming. What they never see coming is not silence, it's restraint. They were ready for your reaction. They expected the explanation. The long message sent too late at night. The careful wording meant to soften the tension. The emotional defense that proves you still care enough to fight for clarity. They were prepared for you trying once again to be understood, because that's the pattern they knew. That's where they felt safe. That's where they felt powerful. What they were never prepared for was the moment you didn't respond. Not because you were confused, not because you were afraid, but because something inside you finally chose discipline over impulse. Real silence isn't weakness, it's control. Every grown man and woman recognizes that moment instantly, the split second when words surge to the tip of your tongue, your chest tightens, your pulse quickens, your mind starts rehearsing the perfect response, the one you believe will finally fix the misunderstanding, restore balance, or bring you back into emotional alignment. You've been there before. You know that urge. And then something different happens. You pause, you breathe, and you don't send it. That pause isn't avoidance. It's power being reclaimed. Because every explanation you've ever given to someone who didn't protect your heart was emotional currency spent with no return. You paid in vulnerability, in patience, in self-betrayal disguised as understanding. And each time you told yourself it was worth it, because clarity felt safer than silence, until it didn't. Over time, a difficult truth becomes impossible to ignore. They only felt powerful because they could predict you. They knew your reactions, your availability, your tendency to fix, to soothe, to reach forward, even when you were the one being pulled away from. Predictability gave them leverage. The moment you stop being readable, something shifts quietly but decisively. Not on the surface, inside them. They don't feel attacked. They don't feel confronted. They feel uncertain. And uncertainty is far more destabilizing than anger. Because when you don't react the way they expect, their internal script collapses. The emotional rhythm they relied on disappears. The version of you they could anticipate, manage, delay, take for granted, is suddenly gone. And in its place is something they can't quite grasp: restraint. Restraint forces reflection. Reflection forces discomfort. Silence doesn't accuse. It doesn't defend. It simply removes your energy from the equation and leaves them alone with themselves. This is why true silence is so rare. It requires maturity. It requires the strength to sit with the discomfort of not being understood right away. It requires trusting that your worth doesn't need constant explanation to remain valid. Most people never reach this point. They keep talking, keep clarifying, keep proving, because silence feels like loss when you're still attached to the outcome. But when you finally understand that not every moment demands a response, something powerful happens. You stop trying to control how you're perceived. You stop negotiating for emotional safety. You stop handing your peace to people who haven't earned access to it. And that's when the balance quietly shifts. Not because you said the right thing, but because you didn't say anything at all. The move they never anticipated was never your absence. It was your self-control. And once restraint enters the room, the old dynamics can't survive. So pause for a moment and ask yourself this. Honestly, have you noticed how people react when you don't respond the way they expect? Or are you still explaining yourself just to feel safe? Because what comes next doesn't depend on them noticing your silence. It depends on whether you're ready to stand by it. Section 2. The decision made in silence. No warning, no explanation. Here is where most people get silence wrong. They think silence is something you announce, a declaration, a message meant to be noticed, a statement designed to provoke a response. They imagine silence as a threat, or worse, a performance, something meant to look strong from the outside. But the most powerful decisions are never staged. They are made quietly, without witnesses. You don't say, "I'm done." You don't give ultimatums disguised as boundaries. You don't demand closure from people who never offered safety. You simply realign, and that realignment doesn't happen in conversation. It happens internally. It's the moment you stop rehearsing what you would say if they asked. The moment you stop preparing explanations that may never be respected. The moment you decide that your energy will no longer be spent managing someone else's comfort. That is real silence. Because when you don't announce your withdrawal, your silence becomes something far more powerful than words. It becomes a test they don't even realize they're taking. Not a test you designed, but one created by the absence of your participation. Your silence turns into a mirror they weren't prepared to look into. A reflection of their behavior without your emotional cushioning. A language they never learned how to speak because it requires accountability instead of reaction. When there's no argument to win, no emotions to manage, no version of you to negotiate with, they are left alone with themselves, and that is deeply uncomfortable. Most people rely on interaction to avoid introspection. As long as you respond, they can stay focused on you, your tone, your timing, your words. But when you remove yourself from the exchange, there's nowhere left to look but inward. And not everyone can handle what they see there. This is why silence feels so threatening to people who are used to access. It removes distraction, it removes leverage, it removes the illusion of control. Not everyone deserves a farewell speech. Not everyone has earned the privilege of your final explanation. Some people only understand meaning when presence is removed, when the familiar energy they relied on is suddenly unavailable. You don't leave with words, you leave with absence. Absence is not cruel, and it's honest. It doesn't argue, it doesn't justify, it doesn't negotiate. It simply states without sound that something no longer aligns. And alignment is the deepest form of self-respect. This decision made in silence is not impulsive. It's not emotional withdrawal disguised as strength. It's the result of clarity, the kind that comes after you've spoken enough, explained enough, and realized that more words would only dilute your truth. Silence becomes your boundary when words have lost their power. And here's the part most people don't expect. You don't need them to understand your silence for it to work. The silence isn't for them, it's for you. It marks the moment you stop orienting your actions around their reactions. The moment you stop waiting for permission to protect your peace. the moment you decide that alignment matters more than approval. And once that decision is made, something irreversible begins, because the next move doesn't require confrontation. It requires consistency. So ask yourself, honestly, without judgment, are you still waiting for the perfect moment to explain your boundaries? Or are you ready to let your silence do the work and step fully into what comes next? Section 3. The exit. They completely misread. They thought it was punishment. It wasn't. Here's the part almost no one understands at first. When you withdraw quietly, they don't read it as strength. They read it as emotion. They tell themselves you're upset, that you're reacting, that this is just another phase, another pause before things return to normal. They assume you'll cool off, that you'll come back once they say the right thing, or once enough time passes and nothing is said at all, because that's how it always worked before. What they don't see is that this decision wasn't sudden. It didn't begin with silence. It began with observation. You noticed the patterns. You noticed how often you adjusted while they stayed the same. You noticed how your patience became an expectation, not an appreciation. You gave chances you never announced. You tolerated things you never complained about. You stayed present through moments that quietly drained you, and all of that happened long before you ever stepped back. The calm exit is never impulsive. It's never dramatic. It's never rushed. It is the final step that comes only after exhaustion. This is why it's so often misunderstood. They think you're pulling away to punish them. They think silence is meant to teach them a lesson. But this isn't revenge. It's preservation. Because staying where you are overlooked doesn't break you all at once. It erodes you slowly. Not in ways that attract attention. Not with arguments or confrontations, but through repetition, being taken for granted, being half seen, being expected to remain available without being valued. Over time, something essential begins to wear down. And one day, quietly, without anger, something inside you chooses itself. That moment doesn't look like rage. It doesn't look like a final speech. It doesn't look like closure. It looks like clarity. You realize that staying is costing you more than leaving ever could. That remaining accessible is slowly trading your dignity for familiarity. That explaining yourself one more time would only ask you to shrink again, so you step away, not to hurt them, not to be noticed, not to force regret. You step away because continuing would mean abandoning yourself. This is why they misread your exit. They're still interpreting it through emotion, while your decision was made through awareness. They expect noise, because noise is what people make when they're still attached. But your silence isn't attachment, it's resolution. And resolution doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand understanding. It doesn't ask to be validated. It simply moves on. This is also why your withdrawal feels so unsettling to them. They're waiting for a reaction that never comes, waiting for proof that they still matter in the same way. But the version of you that kept overextending is no longer available. Not because you became cold, but because you became honest. Honest about what it costs to stay where you are not respected. Honest about how much energy you've already given. Honest about the quiet damage that happens when you keep accepting less than you deserve. Choosing yourself doesn't always look heroic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like walking away without explaining why. But that doesn't make it wrong. It makes it necessary. Because the truth is, being misunderstood for choosing yourself hurts far less than continuing to betray yourself just to be accepted. And once you understand that, something shifts permanently. You stop needing your exit to make sense to them. You stop waiting for permission to protect your peace. You stop explaining decisions that were never meant to be debated. And that's when the next phase begins. Not because they finally understand, but because you no longer need them to. So ask yourself, honestly, without judgment, are you still afraid of being misunderstood for choosing yourself? Or are you finally tired of betraying who you are just to remain accepted? Because the moment you answer that question truthfully is the moment your path stops depending on them and starts moving forward on its own. Section 4. When absence becomes a mirror. This is where it starts destroying them from within. It never hits all at once. That's the first thing to understand. At first, they don't notice. Life continues. Routines fill the space. Distractions do their job. They assume your absence is temporary, another quiet phase that will pass the way it always has. Then, slowly, something feels off. They catch themselves opening old conversations without meaning to, scrolling through messages they once skimmed, rereading words they rushed through because they assumed there would always be more. They replay moments they once dismissed as insignificant, small gestures, familiar patterns, ordinary exchanges that never felt urgent until now. Not because they miss you, because access is gone. This isn't longing, it's disorientation. You were supposed to be there, available, predictable, existing quietly in the background of their life, reachable if they ever decided they needed you. And now, you're not. That's when absence changes shape. It stops being distance and becomes a mirror. And mirrors are unforgiving when there's no one left to blame. With your presence removed, the noise fades. There's no reaction to analyze, no explanation to dissect, no emotion to manage. The familiar dynamic collapses, and what remains is silence, clean, unanswered, and deeply revealing. They begin asking questions, but too late. Questions silence doesn't respond to. What happened? When did this shift? Why didn't I see it coming? The unanswered space does something words never could. It turns inward. It forces reflection. It strips away assumptions that once felt comfortable. Because as long as you were present, they could look outward. They could focus on your availability, your patience, your consistency. They could assume permanence without examining its cost. But absence removes that buffer. And without it, patterns become visible, moments when they delayed, times they took you for granted, opportunities they assumed would always come again. Not because they were cruel, but because certainty breeds blindness. This is why the realization arrives so late. When something feels guaranteed, its value fades into the background. It becomes part of the environment rather than a choice. And only when that environment changes do people notice what it quietly provided. Your absence doesn't accuse them, it doesn't shame them, it doesn't demand accountability. It simply reveals, and revelation is unsettling. They may tell themselves stories at first, that you changed, that you became distant, that something external caused the shift. But those explanations don't settle the discomfort, because deep down they sense the truth. This didn't happen overnight. The mirror keeps reflecting. Each unanswered message, each quiet moment where they expect you to appear and don't, each realization that the version of you they relied on is no longer accessible. And that recognition works slowly, steadily from the inside, not as pain, but as awareness. They don't feel attacked, they feel exposed. Exposed to the fact that what they assumed was constant was actually conditional. Exposed to how easily attention was accepted without being protected. Exposed to how value often becomes visible only after it's removed. This is the power of absence. Not because it hurts, but because it clarifies. It teaches without words. It corrects without confrontation. It transforms memory into meaning. And the hardest part for them is this: there's nothing to respond to. Silence doesn't confirm or deny their conclusions. It doesn't reassure. It doesn't correct misunderstandings. It simply remains. And that stillness forces the reckoning to happen internally. By the time they understand what your presence truly offered, the dynamic has already changed. The questions they now carry don't seek answers from you. They echo inside them. That's why this moment marks a turning point, because once absence becomes a mirror, it can't be unseen. So ask yourself, quietly, honestly, Have you ever felt someone only recognize your value after you stepped back? And more importantly, what did that teach you about how they saw you while you were still there? Because what comes next depends on whether you return to what was familiar or continue forward, carrying the clarity your absence revealed. Section 5. What rejection actually reveals. Not about your worth, about their limits. Rejection cuts deep because most people misunderstand what it means. We're taught, quietly, repeatedly, that being chosen is proof of value. That if someone walks away, hesitates, or fails to meet us where we stand, it must mean we were lacking something essential. Not enough, not ready, not worthy. So the mind turns inward. What did I do wrong? What should I have been? What could I have given more? But this is where perception distorts reality. Rejection is not a verdict on your worth. It never was. Rejection is a revelation of capacity, not yours, theirs. It reveals the limits of what someone can hold emotionally, the depth they can tolerate, the level of presence they can sustain without retreating into fear, distraction, or control. It exposes their comfort zone and the moment your existence quietly exceeded it. Some people don't reject you because you're inadequate. They reject you because you are demanding, not of effort, but of awareness. Awareness requires courage, depth requires responsibility, and not everyone is prepared to meet something real without feeling exposed. This is why rejection so often comes without clarity, without explanation, without honesty, because the truth would require them to admit something about themselves they're not ready to face. Fear of intimacy, fear of commitment, fear of being seen beyond the roles they know how to play. When you understand this, the question changes. You stop asking, "What did I lack?" and you begin asking, "What couldn't they hold?" That shift is everything. Because the first question keeps you trapped in self-doubt. It turns rejection into a personal indictment. It invites endless self-editing, shrinking, and second-guessing in the hope of becoming easier to accept. The second question restores perspective. It reminds you that compatibility is not about effort alone. It's about capacity, about timing, about emotional readiness, about whether someone has the internal structure to meet you without collapsing or pulling away. And with that realization, clarity replaces self-blame. Clarity doesn't shout, it doesn't defend, it doesn't argue its case. Clarity is quiet. It looks back at the situation and sees it whole, without distortion, without desperation. It recognizes patterns that were invisible when you were still trying to be chosen. It notices the hesitation you once rationalized, the distance you once excused, the inconsistency you once absorbed as patience. Clarity doesn't chase answers from people who couldn't give them honestly. It doesn't demand closure from those who avoided depth in the first place. It simply sees. And seeing changes how you move forward. You stop bending to be acceptable. You stop offering more to compensate for someone else's uncertainty. You stop interpreting someone's inability to choose you as a reflection of your value. Rejection loses its sting not because it didn't hurt, but because it finally makes sense. It becomes information, not identity, and that information is powerful. It tells you where not to invest, where not to wait, where not to keep explaining yourself in hopes of being understood. This is especially important for those who give deeply, who show up consistently, who don't love halfway, because people with depth often assume others are capable of meeting them there, and when that assumption breaks, the pain can feel personal. But it isn't. It's structural. It's the difference between emotional availability and emotional limitation. Once you recognize that difference, rejection stops shrinking you. It refines you. It sharpens your discernment. It teaches you to stop negotiating your standards in exchange for acceptance. And something subtle but profound happens. You stop internalizing rejection, and you start extracting its lesson. You learn that being turned away doesn't mean you were wrong. It often means you were ahead. that being passed over doesn't mean you lacked value. It means you didn't fit within someone else's limits. And limits are not yours to fix. So pause here and ask yourself, without judgment, without defensiveness, are you still internalizing rejection as proof of your inadequacy? Or are you ready to see it for what it really exposed? Because once you answer that honestly, you don't just recover your confidence, you recover your direction, and that clarity quietly prepares you for what comes next. Section 6. The shift from pain to authority. How indifference is formed, not performed. There's a moment when pain stops asking for attention and starts demanding direction. That moment is often misunderstood as coldness, as distance, as giving up. But indifference is none of those things. Indifference is not pretending you don't care. It's what remains after you cared fully and finally recognized where that care was wasted. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't arrive because you decided to be stronger one morning. It forms slowly, quietly, after enough experiences teach you the same lesson from different angles. Promises made without follow-through, affection offered without consistency, words that sounded sincere but never became action. You didn't miss these signs. You absorbed them. You adjusted. You gave the benefit of the doubt because you believed patience was strength and understanding was maturity. And for a long time it was, until it wasn't. The strongest people are not numb. They're selective. They don't stop feeling. They stop overextending. They don't shut down. They tighten their focus. They stop asking clarity from confusion. Stop pursuing people who don't choose them back. Stop negotiating their boundaries just to keep the peace. This is the quiet evolution from pain to authority. Authority isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything. Authority shows up as discernment. You no longer chase explanations from people who avoid accountability. You no longer invest energy where effort is one-sided. You no longer confuse emotional labor with loyalty. And that shift changes everything. Because indifference is not a tactic designed to get attention. It's not a strategy meant to trigger regret or provoke pursuit. When indifference is performed, it collapses quickly. It's fragile. It leaks expectation. Real indifference is a result. Built from repeated disappointments, you finally stop rationalizing, from recognizing that almost isn't enough, no matter how familiar it feels. From understanding that consistency matters more than intensity. This kind of indifference doesn't harden you, it stabilizes you. You begin to respond less, not because you're withholding, but because fewer things require a response. You listen more, not to others, but to yourself. You feel the difference between interest and obligation, between connection and convenience. And when reactions stop, the game ends. Not because you won, but because you left the playing field. People who relied on your reactions begin to feel disoriented. They try to provoke the old responses. They test the familiar dynamics, but there's nothing to grab onto anymore. Not because you're distant, because you're grounded. This is where authority replaces pain. You no longer ask, how do I make them see? You ask, why would I invest where I'm not valued? That question doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from self-respect. And self-respect has a very specific energy. It's calm. It's steady. It doesn't rush to correct misunderstandings or defend decisions. It doesn't seek validation for choosing what aligns. It simply moves forward. This is why indifference feels unsettling to people who benefited from your emotional availability. They sense the shift immediately, not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped giving access to who you were. The version of you that over-explained, that waited, that hoped effort would eventually be met with effort. That version has completed its role. What remains is not colder, it's clearer. Clear about where energy belongs. Clear about what deserves patience. Clear about the cost of staying engaged with what no longer grows. This is the quiet authority Stoicism speaks of, Not domination, not detachment for show, but inner alignment. A refusal to bleed repeatedly in the same place. So pause here and ask yourself, without judgment, without defensiveness, do you feel yourself growing indifferent out of bitterness or out of self-respect? Because the answer tells you everything about who you're becoming. And once indifference is rooted in self-respect, it no longer pushes people away. It simply pulls you closer to the life that fits. That is where real power begins. Section 7. The version of you they can't access anymore. Quiet evolution they never prepared for. The most unsettling changes don't announce themselves. There's no declaration, no explanation, no update sent out for approval. Growth rarely arrives with noise. It arrives as a shift, subtle, steady, and irreversible. You don't post about it because it isn't for an audience. You don't explain it because it doesn't require agreement. You don't ask for permission because permission was never yours to request. You simply become harder to reach, not emotionally closed, not distant, energetically selective. The version of you that once overgave is no longer available. The one who over-explained to be understood. The one who overstayed out of loyalty, hope, or habit. That version served its purpose, and then it ended. What replaces it isn't arrogance or detachment, it's alignment. And alignment changes access. People feel this immediately, even if they can't name it. Conversations feel different. Expectations go unmet. Old dynamics stop working. The familiar shortcuts into your time, your attention, your emotional labor no longer open the same doors, and that loss of access unsettles them. Not because you changed who you are, but because they can't interact with you the way they used to. They may say you're distant. They may say you've changed. They may ask what happened, as if something went wrong. But nothing went wrong. What happened was evolution. You stopped being available by default. You stopped giving energy without intention. You stopped allowing proximity to replace respect. Access, after all, is not a right. It's a privilege. And once that truth becomes embodied, not spoken, not argued, but lived, everything recalibrates. People who valued you only for what you provided begin to feel the distance first. Those who relied on your flexibility feel the resistance. Those who mistook your patience for permanence feel the loss. Not because you pushed them away, because you stopped pulling them closer. This is why quiet evolution feels so disruptive to those around you. It removes the version of you they were comfortable with, the one who absorbed, adjusted, and accommodated. And in its place stands someone who is present but no longer pliable. Boundaries become visible without being announced. Standards become clear without being justified. Silence becomes firm without being hostile. And something interesting happens. Respect begins to follow, not because you demanded it, but because access was no longer guaranteed. This is the paradox most people never prepare for. When you stop trying to be reachable to everyone, the right people reach you differently, with care, with intention, with awareness. The rest fade, not out of cruelty, but out of mismatch. You didn't shut anyone out. You simply stopped letting everyone in. And that distinction matters, because the goal of growth was never isolation. It was sovereignty, the ability to choose where your energy goes, to decide who earns proximity, to protect the version of yourself that no longer survives on overextension. This evolution doesn't require you to explain yourself. Explanations invite negotiation, and what you've built isn't up for debate. You're not colder, you're clearer. Clear about what you can give without losing yourself. Clear about who respects your boundaries without resenting them. Clear about the cost of remaining accessible to those who never valued access in the first place. And once clarity sets in, there's no going back. Because the version of you they can't access anymore isn't lost. It's preserved. Preserved for the life you're building, for the relationships that meet you where you stand, for the future that requires strength, not depletion. So pause here and ask yourself, honestly, without justification, Who no longer has access to you? And why did that boundary need to exist? Because the answer doesn't just explain your growth, it confirms it. And once access becomes intentional, the final shift is already underway. One that no one can reverse, not even those who miss the old version of you. Section 8. The calm that ends the game. What truly destroys them from within. This is the part no one prepares for. They expect your silence. They anticipate distance. They even brace themselves for absence. What they are never ready for is your calm, because silence can still contain hope. Distance can still carry longing. Absence can still be emotional. But calm, real calm, signals something final. It appears when silence stops being a pause filled with expectation and becomes autonomy. Autonomy is different. It's the moment you no longer wait for understanding, the moment you stop explaining your decisions in hopes of being accepted, the moment you no longer feel the urge to defend your worth when it isn't recognized. This is where the game ends. Not because you won, but because you stopped playing. Nothing destabilizes a person more than realizing they can no longer move you. No reaction to provoke, no insecurity to touch, no emotional leverage to pull. Your calm removes every handle they once used. You don't argue your boundaries. You don't justify your standards. You don't chase validation from places that never offered respect. And that absence of reaction, that grounded stillness, does something profound. It shifts power inward. They may interpret it as coldness at first. They may say you've changed. They may feel unsettled by how little they affect you now. But you didn't become cold. You became safe within yourself. Safety doesn't mean walls. It means center, a place where your value is no longer dependent on response, where your peace isn't fragile, where your decisions are made from clarity rather than fear of loss. That kind of safety is untouchable, because calm rooted in autonomy cannot be negotiated. It doesn't bend under pressure. It doesn't crack under misunderstanding. It doesn't retreat when it isn't acknowledged. It simply remains. This is what truly works on people from the inside, not your disappearance, but your stability. The realization that the emotional terrain has changed and they no longer know how to navigate it. Your calm doesn't punish them. It releases you. It signals that you've stopped outsourcing your sense of self, that you no longer need reactions to feel real or recognition to feel whole. And that realization, especially for those who once relied on your responsiveness, is deeply unsettling, because calm offers no entry point. No matter what they say, no matter what they withhold, no matter what version of the past they try to resurrect, you remain steady. This is the quiet authority Stoicism points toward. Not dominance, not detachment for show, but inner alignment that makes external validation irrelevant. Once you reach this place, you don't need to disappear dramatically. You don't need to announce your evolution. Your presence alone carries a different weight. Calm ends the game because it removes the incentive to play. And once you stop playing, no one can manipulate you back into old patterns, not with silence, not with attention, not with absence, not with regret. This is the final shift, from reaction to sovereignty, from attachment to self-trust, from needing to be understood to knowing who you are. So pause here, just long enough to ask yourself the only question that matters now. Have you felt this shift? Or are you still explaining yourself to people who never listened? Because the moment you stop explaining is the moment you step fully into yourself, and from there, nothing they do can reach you the way it once did. If there is one truth you are meant to carry with you after this, let it be this: silence only becomes powerful when it stops being a tactic and becomes a way of being. Most people don't fail at silence because silence doesn't work. They fail because their silence is still waiting, waiting for a reaction, waiting for regret, waiting to be chosen again. That isn't silence, that is attachment holding its breath. True silence begins the moment you release the outcome, when your energy stops leaning forward, when your worth is no longer negotiated through explanations, patience, or self-sacrifice. The shift happens quietly, when you redirect your focus from being understood to becoming grounded, from being missed to be built. At that point, something fundamental changes. You stop measuring yourself through other people's responses. You stop reacting to what no longer aligns with who you are. You stop shrinking just to remain accessible. And suddenly, whether they notice you or not becomes irrelevant, because you have already reclaimed what mattered: your time, your direction, your self-respect. Silence was never meant to bring them back. It was meant to bring you back to yourself. Brother, if this message reached you, don't let it fade into the noise. Support this work by liking the video so other men searching for clarity can find it. Subscribe to Stoic Silence for daily lessons in discipline, detachment, and inner strength. And in the comments, anchor this decision by writing "Forward, no permission." Because the truth is this: the moment you stop waiting to be noticed, stop hoping to be chosen, and start building a life that does not depend on validation, you don't become distant, you become centered. And that calm, earned, grounded, unshakable, is what makes you untouchable. Stay disciplined, stay silent when needed, and keep walking your path. We'll meet again at Stoic Silence.